To one now, I really want to get into this issue of housing. Now, would you take a hit on the value of your home if it meant more people could live in homes instead of on streets or in cars? You might have heard me mention the new polling from Q&A and YouGov just released. 74% of Australians would welcome a fall in the property market to make housing more affordable. Just think about that for a second if you're someone who owns your own home or if you're someone who has used the tax concessions we know as negative gearing to establish a property portfolio. And maybe that's how you afford your lifestyle. Maybe that's how you plan to fund your retirement. How would you like to scrap negative gearing tax concessions? Well, again, majority support for that idea revealed in this polling. Also majority support for the idea of drawing on your superannuation savings to buy a home. So for more, I want to introduce you to Saul Eslake. You'll be familiar with Saul, independent economist. Saul, lovely to have you along. Thank you for your company this afternoon.
Good. Thank you for having me on the program.
We are also joined this afternoon by Paul Smith, the Director of Public Data and Affairs with the polling company YouGov. Paul, hello.
Hello, how are you?
Very well. But before we hear from Saul and Paul, I want to hear from Andrew at Kenmore. You've called through with some strong thoughts on this issue. Andrew, what do you reckon about negative gearings for a start?
I think it's definitely played a role in the supply of housing, which has the benefit of, I guess that presupposition you've got there of lowering the values of real estate and rents through that supply. I think that's a critical part of where we're at in the market at the moment. But overall, that policy, I think, is good. And I understand the policy to be that they're just removing the ability to apply negative gearing to second-hand stock. And I think that's going to be great because it's going to push the investment towards new stock and possibly even change the way stock is delivered in an investment sense, because investors are going to have most likely a longer-term hold. So hopefully developers might provide more, attached housing stock in urban areas that families can actually live in instead of little 1- and 2-bedroom units. Andrew, hopefully that would be the outcome.
Yeah, and it sounds like you know quite a bit about this, I presume, and that's always a dangerous thing, that you are a property investor. Would you be interested in some sort of grandfather protections on existing investors as part of this consideration?
Look, I would. I'm a valuer. I think one thing that you might have to consider, though, is that by essentially removing that benefit to an investor in the second-hand stock, are investors simply going to seek higher overall returns in other avenues, ipso facto higher rents, and potentially undermine that requirement for rents to grow at a higher rate than they have or be higher relative to the capital value of real estate to reflect those returns? That will be something for the future to hold. My main concern with this policy really is that it's often been touted in connection with changes to the capital gains tax, which I think would be terrible because that would undermine this policy because you've got a tax on a tax because it'll be a mathematical equation based on an inflation rate. So the danger there is that all these people living in family homes who could downsize, well, they don't want to trade out of that because they won't be able to replace the asset in real terms.
Yeah. Andrew, I'm glad you called. A great place to start the conversation from. Thank you. Andrew's at Kenmore. Kate Feeney with you, 612 ABC Brisbane and Gold Coast, and you can join in on 1300 222 612. Saul Eslake, I will come to you for your response to what we heard from Andrew in a moment, but Paul, can I just bring you back in now because we are talking about this afternoon because of your polling. Three quarters of Australians say it would be a good thing if the housing market fell to make housing more affordable, which just kind of seems a little extraordinary. Paul?
Well, it is extraordinary, except that we're in extraordinary times in terms that housing prices are at a historic high compared to what people earn. And that's why when we ask people if housing prices fell 5% over the next year, whether it be a good thing, 74% of people said yes, because I think, and even if you own a house outright, 73% said yes, or if you have a mortgage, 69% said yes, and people who rent, 85% of those said yes, because I think everybody understands that house prices are really, really high, compared to what people, and even if you own your own house, don't you want your children to be able to go and buy a house or have something where they can afford? So I think people realise that possibly things are just a bit too high, and a gradual easing of pricing would be a good thing. And
the support for changes to negative gearing, Paul, take me through that.
Well, again, people support the change to negative gearing. It is actually even coalition voters support a change to the policy of negative gearing. The reason why people support it is because they see it as when young home buyers or anyone wants to go buy a house for the first time, they're competing against investors who've got effectively a government subsidy. And people see that as unfair, and therefore that's why there seemed to be a change in policy that people would support.
Interesting. Saul Eslake, let's come to you now as an independent economist for your reaction to the poll results and especially this issue of negative gearing.
Well, on the poll results, I'm pleasantly surprised. And I say that because for between 30 and 40 years, I've been wondering why politicians who wring their hands and shed crocodile tears about the difficulties faced by aspiring home buyers who'd like to get their first foot on the property market ladder, nonetheless keep doing things that not only don't work, but actually make it harder for young home buyers to realise the great Australian dream as readily as their parents and grandparents might have done. And by doing things that not only don't work but make it worse. I'm talking about things like first home owner grants, which I call second home vendor grants because that's where the money ends up, stamp duty concessions, mortgage guarantee schemes, shared equity schemes, and now the coalition is proposing allowing people to take up to 40% of their super out and spend that on housing as well. And the thing is, we've got 60 years of history going back to the first homeowner grant scheme that was introduced by the Menzies government in 1964. And it's no coincidence that the home ownership rate peaked at the first census after then in 1966 and has been going down ever since, is that we've got 60 years of history that tells us that anything that allows people to spend more on housing than they otherwise would results in more expensive housing rather than a higher proportion of the population owning that housing. So why do politicians do it? I've always assumed, because for all the crocodile tears that they shed, they know that on average about 100,000 people succeed in becoming first home buyers each year. And if you assume, for example, that for everyone who does, there are 4 or 5 who don't, that's maybe 500,000, 600,000 votes for policies that would restrain the rate of house price inflation. Whereas they also know that at any point in time, there are 11 million or more Australians who own at least one house. There are more than 2 million who own at least one investment property. And the presumption is that the last thing that any of those vastly greater number of voters want is anything that reduces the value of their property or indeed stops it going up at a faster rate than people's incomes. So, that sounds cynical, but I've never found in 40 years of trying to figure out why politicians do what they do that cynicism has led me into error. This poll suggests maybe the penny has started to drop, and that's a very encouraging thing.
Interesting. Stay with me. Saul Eslake with you on 612 ABC Radio Brisbane and Gold Coast 10-1. You're also with Paul Smith, Director of Public Data and Affairs with the polling company YouGov, which has published its data that finds 6 in 10 Australians now support abolishing negative gearing altogether. David at Bribie Island, what do you think about this issue? You've got a question.
I've got a question. If as an investor, I buy a house and I write off my losses through negative gearing, will that, and they stop that, will they then abolish any other investor in any business writing off their losses? For instance, a pharmacy that spends $1 billion developing a new drug over 10 years, will they be stopped from writing off that investment, or a car manufacturer developing a new car?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I suppose Saul Eslake, it has also been argued that changes to negative gearing could push up rents if investors pull out of the market. So does that hold water? And what do you think about David's point?
Well, let me take David's point first. Other people can speak for themselves, but when I've argued for the abolition of negative gearing, I have always argued that that should apply to all investment categories, not just investors in housing. And what I mean by that is that people, investors in housing or stocks or gold or in their own businesses, ought to be allowed to deduct their interest costs against the income which that business, that investment produces, but not allowed to deduct it against their income from other sources, in particular wages and salaries. So, if with negative gearing being abolished, you nonetheless invested in such a way that you paid more in interest than you earned in rent, you could only deduct the interest against the rental income, and you would carry any excess interest over rental income against the capital gains tax liability that you'd crystallise when you sold the property, presumably at a profit. And I would apply the same rules to any other kind of investment, not just restricted to housing. Although, apropos of Andrew's comments earlier, I would probably leave negative gearing in place for those who chose to invest in new housing, because that would help increase the supply of housing, which brings me back to the other part of David's point, yes, and to those who in general argue that if you abolish negative gearing for people who buy existing houses, established houses, that would somehow result in rents going up. 2 points to make about that. The first thing is that when investors outbid would-be home buyers to buy established homes, they like to think they're creating a supply of rental housing and therefore deserve a tax break. But what they're actually doing when they do that is increasing the demand for rental housing, because the frustrated would-be home buyer who gets outbid by a landlord who has his interest bills subsidised by other taxpayers through negative gearing then has to rent. And if you abolished it so that an investor was less inclined to buy an established house, you would reduce the supply of rental housing by one house, but you'd also reduce the demand for rental housing by one house. So there would be no need for rents to go up. The second thing to note, of course, is, as any experienced property investor knows, renting is not a cost-plus business. Just because interest rates go up or the council puts your rates up or you have to pay land tax, that doesn't mean you can pass that on to the tenant. What you can get for rent depends on the balance between the supply of rental housing and the demand for it. And, if vacancy rates are high, then just because interest rates go up or the council raises your rates doesn't mean you can pass that on to the tenant in the form of higher rents. It depends on the state of the market, not on changes in tax policy.
Paul Smith, as the Director of Public Data with YouGov, I mean, you look at figures endlessly, you track various crucial questions and have done so for some time. It strikes me that this is particularly interesting, that perhaps for the first time, 74% of Australians would welcome a fall in the property market to make housing more affordable, that there is support for something like adjustments to negative gearing tax concessions. Paul Smith, Saul Eslake thinking that the penny may well have finally started to drop amongst the Australian voting population. Is that also your view, Paul Smith?
Absolutely. I'll tell you another question we asked. 84% of people think the likelihood of the next generation being able to afford their own home will be worse now. So no matter who it is, it'll be worse for the next group of voters. And that's a fundamental, that's what's been shaping this. And secondly, of course, we actually also asked, people said that 90% of Australians said the collective right of Australians to have a safe, secure home is the most important part of the Australian dream, not the right to become wealthy through property investment. So people think they have values about everyone having a right to secure a home. It's not about making excessive profits. And people also have a view that things are getting worse and something has to change. And that's why people support the things we've mentioned. Also, the most popular solution, particularly for low-income earners, is to spend more on social housing. There's been a report come out that recommends 750,000 homes a year, and there was 83% support for that. And that would be 5 times what the government is building now. So that's a really important part of the solution.
Paul Smith, thank you very much. Paul is the Director of Public Data and Affairs at the polling company YouGov. You can read more about the polling for Q&A at the ABC News website. My name's Kate Feeney. You're on 612 ABC Brisbane and Gold Coast. You've also been hearing from Saul Eslake this afternoon. Saul, we've only got a couple of minutes left. In conclusion, what are we keeping in mind this afternoon about policy reform in regards to the housing market and providing homes for Australians?
Well, what I would say is, briefly as I can, is that the decline in home ownership and the pressure that's now coming on the rental market are the result of long-standing policy failures at all levels of government by governments of both political persuasions. Governments who have, for far too long, needlessly inflated demand by throwing cash at prospective home buyers and allowing investors tax privileges for driving up the price of housing and driving down the home ownership rate, and by policies which have needlessly restrained the growth in the supply of housing, including imposing excessive taxes on new housing construction and restricting people's ability to build more houses at higher densities close to places of employment, entertainment and the like. And if we're going to solve this problem, if we're going to allow people to achieve the goal of home ownership as easily as their parents and grandparents did, and if we're going to allow those who, for whatever reason, aren't able to do that, to have secure rental homes, then we need to be working on both the demand side and the supply side of the markets. We need to be backing away from needlessly inflating the demand for housing and working hard as we can to build more social housing, as one of your callers said, but also to allow the private sector to build more housing that people can afford to buy.
Saul Eslake, appreciate your time this afternoon. Thank you so much.
That's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Saul Eslake is an independent economist.